Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It is always good to be back home on the yard. And it's my particular honor to be able to speak to you this afternoon about issues as it relates to Africa and contemporary African policy. I'd like to do three things really. The first, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of regional studies. Second, I'm going to give you a few minutes of a prepared text from an article that I wrote, which was published this summer in Survival magazine, which is the magazine at the International Institute for Strategic Studies. And for the remainder of the time, I'd be happy to open the floor to questions on matters of Africa, practice of diplomacy, international affairs, anything else you'd like to talk about. First, I could not be happier about the Naval Academy's initiative to have a Center for Regional Studies and the ability not only to encourage midshipmen to understand other parts of the world, but also to provide the actual opportunities for you to do so. As Commander Flynn mentioned, I'm currently serving as the Dean of the Elliott School of International Affairs at the George Washington University, which is one of the largest schools of foreign affairs in the United States. And in the study of international affairs, there has been a debate the last 20 or 30 years or so about the importance of regional studies as opposed to the study of international relations theory or more specific directed studies on matters like international political economy or security studies or whatnot. I am a firm believer in the vital importance of regional studies for a variety of reasons. First, as a foreign affairs professional, your ability to demonstrate a particular expertise in one region of the world demonstrates to the rest of the world that you actually can be an expert in something. And that you can be an expert and develop both the language skill, the importance of the understanding of the history, the politics, the culture of a particular region, which gives you the overarching framework to apply any other series of skill sets, whether it is the ability to conduct combat or the ability to do business or the ability to conduct diplomacy. The second reason it's important to study a particular region of the world is that studying one particular region of the world often gives you entree into other regions. For example, my particular regional expertise is Africa, but because of the increased importance engagement of China on the continent of Africa, it is all the more important to understand contemporary Chinese foreign policy. If you want to understand contemporary African history, you obviously have to understand Africa's relationship mostly with Europe and former colonial powers. All these things are incredibly important. So as all of you are beginning your studies in international affairs and I hopefully develop an interest in at least one region, just know that I think you're on the right track. I hope that you will continue to pursue it both in your time in uniform and also further on in your professional life. So now what I'd like to do is to present to you a summation, sort of excerpts from an article, as I mentioned, that I wrote that was published in the 58th volume of Survival this past summer. And the article is entitled "The New Pan Africanism: Implications for U.S. Africa Policy." So I'll give you some excerpts for the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, and then I'll be happy to take your questions for the balance of the time we have remaining. Thus begins the article. The idea that Africa, a continent shared by more than 50 states with unique histories, cultures, and interests, could be more than the sum of its parts dates back at least as far as May 1963, when an emerging sense of a common African destiny led the leaders of Free Africa to gather in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, to create the Organization for African Unity. Almost 40 years later, a similar feeling of Pan-African identity led to the founding of the African Union, or the AU. A sense of continental solidarity can be seen in the cultural products such as the poetry of Leopold Senghor and the songs of Miriam Makeba, and also in the behavior of African states in multilateral forums such as in the UN General Assembly and also in the World Trade Organization. The tendencies for states to adopt and to adhere to common African positions in a variety of such fora reflects an understanding of, as well as a commitment to, a set of particularly African interests that are best pursued collectively rather than individually. The persistence of national rivalries among and the pursuit of divergent policies by certain African states is not necessarily evidence that Pan-Africanism has no political merit or consequence, any more than differences in policies or the persistence of tensions amongst European nations represent an indictment of the idea of Europe. Rather, It merely demonstrates the complexity of African states' foreign policies as they try to advance their interests both unilaterally on the basis of their own national capabilities or multilaterally under the banner of African solidarity. If the idea of Africa has genuine purchase in international affairs, can the United States see Africa as a strategic partner? To answer this question, it is useful to look at what a strategic partner is. In recent years, there has been a proliferation of strategic partnerships between the United States and other countries and entities. Today, the U.S. has 4 such partnerships within Africa alone. They are with Angola, Nigeria, South Africa, and with the African Union Commission itself. A strategic partnership is a customary agreement or formal agreement between 2 polities, such as a sovereign state or a multilateral organization, to engage regularly in purposeful dialogue and to pursue mutual interests together over time. The strength of a strategic partnership depends on 3 elements. The first is the breadth and coincidence of the partners' enduring interests. The second is the degree of trust in the relationship. And the third is the capacity of each party to apply resources for the advancement of their shared interests. The relationships that the United States enjoys with the United Kingdom and NATO exemplify the gold standard of strategic partnerships. Conversely, the failure of Washington's attempt to reset relations with Moscow show how clashing interests and mutual mistrust can limit a would-be partnership. There are several elements of a potential strategic partnership between the United States and Africa, and they are defined, can be defined, by the 4 elements of President Obama's strategic partnership for strategic strategy for sub-Saharan Africa. This strategy is based on 4 pillars. The first is strengthening democratic institutions. The second is spurring economic growth, trade, and investment. The third is advancing peace and security. And the fourth is promoting opportunity and development. Each of these areas of interest has been pursued in Africa as a matter of stated policy or of actual practice by every U.S. administration, both Republican and Democratic, since the end of World War II. And even more significantly, each of these 4 areas are consistent with what Africa says it wants for itself. In the interest of time, I will skip over my case for why basically each of these 4 areas shows promise in the development of a strategic partnership between the United States. If you'd like to see more detail, go read the article. But let me just sum and take my word for it, press the I believe button, as we used to say at the Naval Academy. You may still say it today. And simply accept this premise, that it is clear, at least I argue that it is clear, that there is sufficient convergence of interest, sufficient degree of trust, and the collective capacity on each side of this relationship to establish a strategic partnership between the United States and Africa. Such a partnership holds the potential to help define the 21st century. Many of the challenges that will confront the international community in the coming decades, such as adaptation to climate change, ensuring peace and security in an age of violent non-state actors, ending extreme poverty and expanding economic opportunity, are all at play in Africa. And to solve them, the United States needs Africa as a whole, in addition to individual African countries, to be a willing, capable, and dependable partner. I argue that there are at least 4 ways, in addition to current ongoing initiatives, in which the U.S. could advance the project of African unity in a manner that would also support both sides' interests. Those 4 ways are, first, by actively supporting the idea of Pan African unity. The second, by substantially increasing financial, material, and technical support for African democratic institutions. The third, by involving the U.S. private sector to an even greater extent in these initiatives. And the fourth, by improving problematic U.S. bilateral relationships on the continent. I will touch briefly on each of these four. First, on supporting Pan-African unity. The achievement of a peaceful, prosperous, and integrated Africa is the raison d'etre of the AU and a goal that enjoys unanimous rhetorical support across the continent. Given the strength of this political ideal, the United States should be a proactive advocate of Pan-African unity. Many, if not most, Africans would interpret such a position as American support for the destiny that Africans have already chosen for themselves. This would likely improve levels of trust in American motives among the African political class. Moreover, American support for goals that Africans have already made a rhetorical commitment to, such as respect for human rights, democracy, and economic prosperity, could be a powerful statement on the convergence of American and African interests. Conversely, U.S. ambivalence or hostility toward Pan-African unity can only fuel mistrust about American motives on the continent and limit the possibilities for the United States to influence its political development. Let me say briefly that as the institutional project of building African unity proceeds apace, a debate has emerged within U.S. policy circles about whether a stronger and more united Africa is indeed good for America. On the one hand, an Africa that can speak more authoritatively about its own interests and that can enforce its own standards on matters such as economic integration and respect for human rights could be a powerful ally of the United States for the advancement of mutual interests both in Africa and beyond. On the other hand, there is a legitimate fear that a more united Africa could act against U.S. priorities, as it did, for example, in the 2013-2014 with its rejection of the International Criminal Court jurisdiction over sitting African heads of states, or as it might by supporting adversarial Chinese or Russian positions in the UN Security Council or elsewhere. This debate, it should be said, resembles similar discussions in the 1990s concerning how a strengthened European Union might affect American interests in Europe and beyond. On balance, in the nearly 25 years since the signing of the Maastricht Treaty, it has become clear that a strong EU has been good for American interests as well. Any differences between the US and the EU on matters such as the World Trade Organization disputes or the wisdom of the 2003 Iraq War have been overshadowed by the strong cooperation they have demonstrated in other areas, such as jointly fighting piracy off the Horn of Africa or in responding to the Ebola crisis of 2014. A similar dynamic could develop between the US and Africa. A generation from now, the project of African unity could be both far more advanced than it is today and demonstrably beneficial for both the US and African interests. But achieving this result will require consistent rhetorical support from American foreign policy leaders for the Pan-African ideal. At the same time, it will also require specific policy initiatives to advance regional integration on the continent. Again, for more specifics on those initiatives, I will refer you to the written article. Next, on increasing support for African democratic institutions. Although Africa's political commitment to democratic governance is strong, its institutions to support democratic governance are relatively weak. Understaffed and underfunded, entities such as the AU's Department for Political Affairs, which is charged with vital functions such as election monitoring and political mediation, could be important drivers for strengthening democratic governance on the continent. Yet both African states and external partners alike have invested far more heavily in the continent's security architecture than they have in Africa's governance structures. The long-term economic growth and political stability of Africa is dependent on the ability to solidify still fragile and uneven gains in democratic governance in accordance with Africa's commitments to itself. It will be challenging at best, however, for Africa to achieve this result on its own. Though several African countries, like Ghana, Mauritius, and South Africa, have established strong democratic political cultures, there is no democratic center of gravity on the continent that can meaningfully exert positive pressure on less democratic countries to improve their governance. In contrast, the prospect of enjoying the economic prosperity and political freedoms of the EU, as well as the requirement to implement the EU's acquis communautaire, or body of laws, were powerful incentives for the former communist countries of Eastern Europe to reform their political systems in line with the requirements for EU membership. In this case, the established democracies of Western and Central Europe exerted a kind of gravitational pull to help the newly independent countries of Eastern Europe accelerate and solidify their commitment to democratic governance. In the absence of such a democratic center of gravity, the best alternative is for external partners outside of Africa to strengthen democratic institutions in Africa through financial assistance and technical support. And again, for specifics in this case, I refer you back to the article. It is worth knowing this and imagining this possibility. If this democracy building project were successful, Africa, with its 54 sovereign states, could well become the largest democratic region in the world. A generation ago, few would have predicted that most of Moscow's Warsaw Pact allies would one day be part of a democratic Europe, or that almost all of Latin America would be governed by freely elected leaders rather than by unaccountable despots. Africa has the potential to be the world's next democratic success story, but both the continent and its partners will need to take specific action to realize this vision. Third, engaging the U.S. private sector. Private sector-led economic growth will be vital to writing Africa's next chapter. The security and prosperity of the continent depend on the generation of enough jobs to employ more than 200 million young people intent on building their futures. For most African leaders, the prospect of large numbers of unemployed young people is not simply an economic challenge, but also a political and social threat. As such, U.S. political influence in Africa will likely depend at least as much on economic linkages with African economies as on political ties to African governments. The United States, therefore, has a vital economic and political interest in facilitating the entry of American businesses into virtually every sector of Africa's economy. At the same time, opportunities for American firms to engage in profitable enterprises in Africa are multiplying as many African economies continue to expand and as labor in Asia becomes more expensive. In the interest of time, I'll skip over many of the details of Africa's economic growth, but let me simply say one thing. Many of you may have read about or seen evidence of dramatically increased Chinese economic engagement on the continent, which has done two things. The first is that it has demonstrated that there are indeed profitable economic opportunities on the continent, as well as serious social and governmental needs that can only be met by the private sector. And the second is that it has woken American firms and indeed the American government, both in terms of the importance of economic engagement on the continent and also to the reality that Africa has alternatives for partnerships. And thus one cannot presume that American engagement or American influence a generation from now in Africa will be left unchecked or unchallenged. Third, resolving problematic bilateral relationships. The political importance of Pan-African unity means that the nature of U.S. bilateral relationships with individual African countries can have regional and even continental ramifications. The relationship between the United States and Cuba and its implications for American engagement in the Western Hemisphere is an appropriate analogy. For decades, the hostile character of U.S.-Cuban relations had a dampening effect on U.S. relations with Latin America, as a whole. Thus, a major factor in the Obama administration's calculus in normalizing relations with Cuba was the positive impact that such a move would have had on U.S. standing in the entire region, in addition to the implications for the bilateral relationship. The strength of the Pan-African narrative in African politics is arguably even stronger than the call for regional solidarity in Latin America. Thus, it is essential that the United States take into account the impact of its bilateral relationships in Africa on its engagement with certain subregions, or indeed with the continent as a whole, and that it calibrate its diplomatic engagement accordingly. And while there are a handful of U.S.-Africa bilateral relationships that have regional or continental ramifications, the most important of these, by far, is the U.S. relationship with Zimbabwe. In the Q&A, I'm happy to talk more about that relationship and what could be done to alter it further if there is interest. In conclusion, let me say that Africa is more than a collection of countries sharing the same landmass. It is also an idea encompassing the belief that all Africans should live in harmony, prosperity, and dignity. It is an idea that is no less powerful and no less achievable than the aspiration of the founding fathers of the United States to build a country in which life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness were guaranteed to all. The current state of Africa's complex politics and myriad challenges does not render this idea invalid. Rather, Africa's problems make it all the more attractive. As the United States grapples with unprecedented global challenges in the coming decades, it will need Africa to be a partner in seeking solutions. It is therefore in the interests of the United States to work with Africans to make the idea of Africa a reality. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm now happy to take your questions on this article or anything else you want to talk about. Thanks very much.
Okay, when I call on you, go ahead and just introduce yourself. Since you were the first hand up, let's go for it.
I have a question. How likely is it for Libya and Egypt, for example, to turn into democratic countries one day?
The question is, how likely is it for Libya and Egypt to turn into democratic countries one day? It is certainly feasible. In fact, Egypt arguably was democratic, that they had a free and fair election in which the Muslim Brotherhood won, and that was subsequently led to the Egyptian revolution when, frankly, the Brotherhood, having won, did not understand the culture of democracy and took an extremely hard line, which is ironic because they could have still been in power had they even sort of showed a bit of give. And as a result of that, Egypt reverted back to type and is now being led by Mohamed Morsi, and will likely, and it's hard to see that being reversed anytime soon. Libya is a completely different case. I mean, Libya is a complete basket case right now. Although there is a UN process afoot to try to bring some sort of peace to Libya, the first goal, frankly, is to come to some kind of negotiated settlement that both the parties in Tobruk as well as the parties in Tripoli can actually live with, just to stop the fighting, and then move to, and hopefully do so in a framework that is representative of the various tribes and various interests at stake. So whether or not, so you have basically two fundamentally different challenges. On the Egyptian side, you have a country that tried democracy, felt burned by it, essentially, and had the choice of either coming back to some sort of democratic process with the structure of democracy, but without the culture to go along with it, the culture of compromise, which is essential, and therefore is now back in the line of Anwar Sadat, in the line of Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser. Now sort of Mohamed Morsi is now sort of essentially one in that sort of pharaonic line of Egyptian leaders, if you will. And then, but having done that, you could conceive of a scenario in which there is, with a very organized civil society, at least some movement towards greater openness within the Egyptian political climate. That will depend heavily on whether or not, frankly, there is the ruling elite in Egypt feels the need to be able to liberalize, or if Morsi basically sort of takes a look at Mubarak and said the problem with Mubarak not was that he didn't liberalize, his problem was that he was just too old and too weak and could no longer control, and that history shows that Egypt must be led by simply a strong personality if they can move past that. The problem in Libya is how do you just stitch the fabric of a society back together? And whether or not that stitching of the fabric back together will happen as a result of a strong leader, as was the case under Muammar Gaddafi for many years, or if one can take this opportunity, such as it is, of a fundamentally broken system and try to stitch it back together with something of a representational process, which is basically what's happening now. The question is whether or not the parties on the ground will allow that to happen. So do I think that either state is likely to become a Jeffersonian democracy in the near term? No. But as I said in my piece, both are absolutely active members in the African Union. And what is interesting about this is the extent to which indigenous African institutions could be used to hold both countries to account, not to the account of what the United States says or what Western governments say, but hold them accountable to what Africans have said they want for themselves on their own continent. And that's the fundamental question, diplomatic question, according.
Nisham is second class white.
Hi.
This question kind of goes along with what you're kind of talking about in this question previously. Sir, so my question is, there's been discussion that some cultures simply aren't suited to observe certain types of government and governmental styles. From your experience and your wealth of knowledge of what you've learned, what have you seen that would lead you to believe that democracy is viable in the many countries and cultures of Africa?
So the question is, there is a school of thought that some countries are simply not culturally ready or culturally attuned to a democratic form of governance, and that democracy is fundamentally sort of important. What is my view of that? I would say three things. First of all, it clearly is a debatable proposition. And one can find evidence on both sides of that equation, right? You can find more authoritarian or less democratic institutions in Western societies. After all, we evolved as a democracy as a deliberate attempt to move away from a divine right monarchy, right? Well, essentially. And the democratic process we can find in Western Europe, whether it be the Franco regime in Spain, other examples of serious, more authoritarian examples in what is now clearly a democratic West. One can find other examples in other parts of Asia and Latin America, the extent to which democracy is more or less practiced. That said, I also firmly believe that culture matters. And that there are different ways to think about how, say, democratic institutions or other forms of governance are practiced in ways that make more sense for a particular local context. In my experience, the people who often argue that democracy is not suited to a particular culture tend to fall into one of two groups. Either they are authoritarians within that culture that do not want to open up the question of democracy for fear of losing power, or they are people outside of that country that have an interest in arguing that people X are not suitable to govern themselves through democratic processes for ways that either suit their own narrative or suit their own approach to the country. One of the things I would often say to African counterparts and others is, if you think that country X, that the people of country X don't want to be governed in a democratic process, how do you know? The only way you can know is to ask them, and if you ask them, that is by definition democracy, right? So it is, and again, it's also worth noting that every international fora that we have is governed by some form of democratic process, and is participated in by countries that do not practice democracy at home. So how do we know that a resolution from the UN General Assembly, or that a ruling by the World Trade Organization, or by a ruling by the UN Security Council, or a ruling by the African Union is valid? Because of a vote that is taken by representatives of members of that organization. So clearly there is some validity in the very notion of it. And if you ask people, particularly those people that are not in power in those countries, most would tell you that they would prefer to have democracy. So I am one, call me an American, call me a not fully recovered American diplomat, but I'm one who absolutely believes in the importance of representative democracy, and it simply is a matter of time and cultural appropriateness to get to a form of government that allows full participation of the people.
Let's go in the back there.
Sir, I'm a shipment for the class Barton. So you talked about how, in order to encourage this you talked about the U.S. encouraging this Pan Africanism and working to promote democracy in Africa.
Yeah.
But you also talked about China's engagement.
Yes.
How would a country which is not exactly the most democratic country, such as China, respond to attempts by the U.S. to promote democracy in an area which it might consider sort of very important for its strategic interests?
Sure, I'll tell you, the easy way to answer that question is to tell you what's already happening, right? So, let's take a step back. Traditionally speaking, U.S. engagement in Africa has had a few chapters. There was obviously sort of pre-Cold War, pre-World War II, really, in which the nature of our engagement with the continent of Africa fell into one of a series of baskets. One is obviously the slave trade. The second was with, starting in the late 1900s, the sort of the Go Back to Africa movement led by people like Marcus Garvey, which led to the creation of Liberia, which sees itself as having a special relationship with the United States. And the third is vis-a-vis European allies of the United States that had substantial colonial possessions in Africa. And that's even after World War I and Woodrow Wilson's sort of declaration of free right of determination, which applied to lots of the world, but in his view didn't really apply to Africa for the most part. After World War II and the start of the Cold War, like most of the rest of the world, U.S. engagement in Africa was seen largely through the lens of Cold War competition with the Soviets, which led to a variety of unsavory relationships the United States had with, frankly, a variety of strongmen in Europe or systems of governance that we would now repudiate, whether it be, for example, relations with strongmen like Mobutu Sese Seko of what was then Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of the Congo, who was an arch anti-communist, but also was like the archetypical kleptocrat of the planet and ruled the Congo with an iron fist, or whether it be with the US engagement with apartheid South Africa, because they saw themselves proudly as anti-communists, which is the most important thing to US foreign policy, let alone, and for which we were able to sort of look aside the horrific nature of the apartheid regime in South Africa. After the fall of the Berlin Wall and after the engagement after the end of the Cold War, U.S. engagement with Africa, broadly speaking, was focused on a few things. One was various forms of humanitarian engagement, whether it be through humanitarian action in response to massive natural events, or responding to the humanitarian aspects of civil wars, or support for newly independent democratizing states, like we supported after full democracy came to South Africa in 1994. But very little of it had to do with serious economic trade. About a decade ago, in fact, The Economist had as its on its front cover Africa, the hopeless continent, which it followed 10 years later, about 2 years ago, with Africa rising, now that 7 of the 10 fastest growing economies on the planet are in Africa. One of the reasons that led to that was significant engagement with China on the continent. That engagement has a number of aspects to it. The first is economic engagement for the sake of taking raw materials out of Africa and shipping them back to China. For those of you that have studied economics in high school, that are taking Econ 101, you're learning about mercantilism as an economic system that was practiced by the colonial powers in the 17th and 18th, 19th century. You have colonies to bring raw materials back to the metropole, finished goods, send finished goods back to the colonies, and thus it enriches the metropole but not the colonies. That is essentially what China is doing for the most part now. whether it be cobalt out of DR Congo, timber out of Mozambique, buying just land in Ethiopia to be able to to grow rice or to grow cotton to be able to ship back. All these sorts of things what China is not doing are building, for the most part, factories to produce finished goods in Africa that will employ Africans and generate wealth for Africa. That also has a strong political component to it as well, on the theory that if these economic ties are strengthened between China and various African governments, whether it be individually or regionally, that can redound to Chinese political benefit in areas where they may need it, whether it be on the UN Security Council if China and Taiwan ever come to blows, or whether it be in terms of disputes in the WTO or other sorts of things. Now, one of the arguments, broadly speaking, that the Chinese make to African governments is like, look, we, China, are just like all of you, African governments. We were once a developing country. We are now, have large parts of us that are developing, but we're also now one of the richest countries in the world, if you take a look at the size of their sovereign wealth. We once were colonized just like you. We, like you, overthrew our colonial masters. We thus have an adversarial, or at least a complicated relationship with the West. Even better, unlike the United States, we, China, never enslaved anybody. We never enslaved anybody, we never colonized anybody, therefore we are just like you. So, as you are looking for both an economic partner as well as a political model to follow, don't we look like a better bet than either your former colonial masters in Belgium, Portugal, the UK, or France, or, this one always gets me, that neo-colonial superpower, the United States, given that we were not colonialists. In fact, we sort of had our own sort of colonial break. So, what I would often say to US audiences that are thinking about engaging in Africa and how we think about China is, on the one hand, it's a great danger, because the Chinese are offering a political model that is 180 degrees at odds, to your question, with what the United States and its Western allies have on offer. And if you are the ANC in South Africa, if you are Yoweri Museveni in Uganda, if you are the EPRDF in Ethiopia, if you are Paul Kagame in Rwanda, the idea that you can have essentially political, economic prosperity without political liberty is very attractive. Which gets back to your question, that the people who argue that democracy is a Western concept that might have to have a particular African interpretation, that, oh, by the way, leads some people stay in power for their entire lives, is an argument that you do not hear from African civil society activists. It's an argument if you hear from anybody, from people that are currently in power, or parties that are in power in Africa now. But what I often say, in fact, what I said when I was chief of mission, is that the United States is the natural partner of choice for Africa, because we have a common history, much of it painful, much of it hopeful, between the United States and Africa. And also because if you take at face value what Africa says it wants for itself, democracy, prosperity, broad human rights, all things which are in black and white in the founding and continuing developed documents of the African Union, these are all things that the United States stands for and that are an integral part of our foreign policy. However imperfectly we practice it, we are closer to that ideal than China is. The final thing I'll say to answer your question is that I do not think it is helpful to recreate a new essential Cold War competition in Africa between China and the United States. I do think, however, increasingly, that as African political systems have more longevity, for lack of a better phrase, become more mature, they have choices in the world. And thus, it is important for the United States to continue, and its Western allies, to continue to argue why both current African governments and, crucially, younger people in Africa, as they think about how they want their countries to look, what lessons they want to take, that they increasingly look west rather than east, because we will, frankly, be tied together going in the future, and it's more important they look to us instead.
Let's go in the middle of the very back.
Sir, Chief and Second Class Gilbert. I'm curious, we talk about like building democracy and building democratic institutions in Africa. I did I think the international relations class last year, when we talked in depth about Libya in 2011.
Yeah.
Kind of how the United States had a lot of
Yeah.
failed. So my question is kind of, what do you think we could have done better in Libya in 2011 and looking forward in other African nations?
Yeah.
Specifically, what can we do to prevent
Yeah.
causing states to, or being a factor in states failing?
That is a really good question. It's one, frankly, that I wrestled with a lot at the African Union. It's a complicated set of answers. It's one that I feel I'm glad I'm no longer in government because I can now answer pretty openly my personal view on this. Senator Jack Reed of Rhode Island, who is a West Point grad, once said that the definition of a bad policy is one that leaves you with no good options. And one can reasonably argue that the nature of U.S. engagement, of Western engagement, of which the U.S. is a part in Libya, is one that has left everybody with very few good options. From the, let's remember where we were in 2011. Start of the Arab Spring, fruit seller, self-emulates himself in the streets of Tunis. Starts the Arab Spring. You get essentially democracy in Tunisia. You get a similar uprising in Egypt, which leads to a democracy for a minute, and then you have forces of revanchism that in Tahrir Square that sort of come back. And in Syria, you have literally at the same time in Libya, you have peaceful protests in the streets of Damascus that then lead to a violent backlash by the Assad regime, which has now led to now being in the 5th year of arguably the most brutal war on the planet. So the more interesting question, frankly, is given that you have the example of Libya and Syria at the same time, and you have the choice of Western intervention supported by the United States in Libya, armed intervention, and you have the choice of not to intervene with armed force in Syria, but you have the same sets of issues at stake, which are concerns about crimes against humanity. What explains the differences in the outcomes? Because if there, as we all know, international affairs, although we try to think of political science as a science, it's not like physics or chemistry, right, where you can have controlled experiments. But if ever there were two situations that led themselves to enough similarity to ask this question, what is the appropriate response to both democracy building and response to potential genocide at the same time? It's hard to find two other examples. One of the further complications for purposes of our discussion today is there was, and this is actually something that's not talked about broadly, but there was a peace process that was, at least a diplomatic process that was underway by the African Union at the time to try to convince Muammar Gaddafi to engage in a diplomatic dialogue with the opposition in Benghazi as opposed to armed confrontation. You will also remember, however, that days before the NATO-led intervention, Muammar Gaddafi got on state television and said, "I will march to Benghazi and go street to street, house to house, door to door, closet to closet, and kill everybody that is in uprising." For a government like the United States, where there are very senior people in power who were present during the 1994 genocide in Rwanda and really believed in never again, this was as clear a call as you could get that there was a genocide that was imminent and there was some sort of military action that had to be taken in order to stop it. Now, what the Africans would tell you is that they were essentially duped at the UN Security Council into supporting a UN Security Council resolution that authorized the use of force by NATO. And what they thought they were authorizing was essentially the threat of force as opposed to the actual action. This is made even more complicated, obviously, by the fact that Muammar Gaddafi was a patron, financially, of much of the rest of Africa, which almost certainly affected the decision calculus of many of the states that wanted to see a more negotiated solution. Sorry, just one second. So in my view, the direct answer to your question, the most profound failure of the action wasn't necessarily the decision to use armed intervention per se. It was the abject failure to have a plan for what would come afterwards. Now, we frankly have not had a really good track record of nation building post intervention, but at least certainly having no plan is a worse outcome than having a not good one. And as a result, we see now insecurity not only in Libya, but also insecurity that's coming across the desert into southern Libya and affecting the entire rest of the Sahel. Sorry.
Thank you so
Sure.
much. Let's thank Ambassador Briggs. I really struggled. What are we going to get the man who has everything? So we wanted to contribute to your wall, maybe in your office, the poster.
Oh, that's lovely.
For your visit.
Thank you very much. It's very kind. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
I wish we had more time.
Beat Army.